All right, we are live. Taylor Kruse is here. Taylor, thanks for joining me today, man. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. The podcast we did a couple weeks ago was fantastic. So, and talking to you again, you had this idea of like, hey, I think something that we could do for the audience is talk specifically about the gait cycle for runners. So let's just dive into it, man. Let's talk about how you kind of approach this thing that we all do, but there's some nuance to it. So, floor is yours.
Yeah, for sure. So, one of the reasons why I thought it would be so useful to cover some gait cycle concepts is obviously because so many of your listeners are trail runners and OCR athletes and people who are concerned about their gait on a daily basis because it's such a large part of what they do athletically. And the topic of gait cycle is actually a really complex one. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to people is that when it comes to understanding your own gait cycle and making improvements in your gait, it's very, very useful to understand some things about the brain and nervous system, because gait cycle is actually an expression of the brain and the nervous system and how they're functioning. Because we often think about gait cycle as purely biomechanical. And of course, biomechanics matter when it comes to gait. But what also matters is that we have control centers for those biomechanics. So when you have your gait evaluated, and let's say you have a coach telling you, hey, you're doing this weird thing with your foot. Your foot's outwardly rotated. Why is that happening? It's very difficult to then say, okay, next time I run, I'm not going to outwardly rotate my foot. You could make a voluntary correction by not outwardly rotating your foot, and that may be doable for a short distance. But then the question is, in making a voluntary correction, are you just wasting energy in bringing attention to something that you don't really want to be thinking about? Mm-hmm. So especially for long distance stuff, it's going to be pretty hard to make a voluntary correction for a long period of time, and it becomes really energy expensive. And sometimes you do that and you build tension and walk away from running being like, I thought I fixed the outwardly rotated foot, but for some reason now my hamstring is tight. Right? So these are the kinds of things that sometimes happen to people when they're trying to make a voluntary correction for any long period of time.
And so, I think
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think about this whenever we're talking about the gait cycle or changing running form. To me, it is more of a mental exercise, and it's almost advantageous to like break it up into intervals where it's like, all right, we'll just do it for like a minute, because it's going to be hard. It's going to be daunting. It's going to be way less fun, and you're probably just going to regress without thinking about it. Right. And then potentially get frustrated. But it's also interesting that I never thought of it in terms of an energy cost, but you're right? Like it costs energy to.
Right. And you can have really the same conversation about any athletic activity. I mean, making voluntary corrections is very difficult. And the issue that comes up when you're trying to change gait cycle voluntarily and it's being stubborn, you're not having success. The reason you may not be having success is because you have a reflexive issue and it's coming from a higher order system. So you're not able to say, hey, I just want to change this thing, because higher order systems take priority, and gait is a very reflexive process. So we all kind of understand that when it comes to walking or running, you do it without thinking about it. Right? You don't have to walk down the street and say, okay, right leg, left leg, right leg, left leg, right leg, left leg. If you had to do that, it would be extremely, energy expensive and difficult. Mm-hmm. So the reason why we have to look at the brain and nervous system with gait is because we have to understand these higher order systems enough to know how they work into gait so that we can use different means of training to upregulate these systems and hopefully create change in our gait process. So when I'm working with clients and athletes, one of the things I'm doing quite often is using what we call a neurologic gait evaluation to understand these higher order systems and how they're functioning. and to really understand or to use it as a window into a person's brain function, because every system is involved in gait. Again, it's not just biomechanics, everything's involved. So gait, the way that you walk, the way that you run, it's really your signature. And if we know how to look at your signature and tease out these little things, we can target the appropriate system and hopefully have carryover into changing our gait, but getting more of a reflexive change so that we can then integrate this change over time. So here's what that process looks like. And we're going to go over how I would look at it, and then we'll kind of hone in on a couple of the actual pieces of the evaluation, and then even give some possible solutions.
Yeah, I'd love some some examples, like what that actually looks like.
Yeah. So gait. So truth be told, like in any, I think, movement professional or therapist would tell you who's interested in looking at gait, like looking at gait is it's a lifelong process. Like once you start diving into like all the nuances of gait, it's overwhelming, right? And if you look at it biomechanically and you're just looking at muscles, it can bring you into a rabbit hole because there's just so much that goes into the function. So instead of looking at every muscle in the body and how it works during gait process, we look at gait through this neurocentric lens, and we break it down like this. And the first thing that I'm looking at when I watch a person walk or run is I'm trying to identify whether or not they have a bobble head. And a bobble head means that their upper cervical spine is somewhat unstable, and that would be expressed during walking or running as literally a little bit of bobbling in the head. And it's very subtle at times. So, and I think that people who have a background in running, like people have probably seen others out there running, and they're running down the street, and you see a lot of this,
like ponytails swinging type of deal.
Yeah, you see some odd head movements. So bobble head is number one. So we'll go through all four of these things, and then we'll kind of go back to each one and get some ideas going. Number two is a loss of arm swing. So if I'm walking or running, we're evaluating arm swing, and we'd like to see the majority of that arm swing coming from the shoulder. And so decreased amount of arm swing could mean something to us. Increased amount of arm swing could mean something to us. After that, we're looking at what is called a cerebellar presentation in gait. And cerebellar refers to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is a brain area that is largely responsible for helping us with balance and accuracy and coordination and rhythm of movements. So that's a big one that we're going to probably discuss the most here in a moment. And following that is what we would call a Pmrf Gate presentation. And that stands for pontomedullary reticular formation. And it's not anything you ever need to know or memorize. So we say Pmrf, and if we want to make it even simpler, we are referring to the brainstem. So the brainstem is a structure that is largely involved in helping our dynamic postural control and our muscle tone. And so it goes into gait, and you can I'll explain what a Pmrf gait may look like.
Okay.
So those are the four things that I'm evaluating when I'm looking at a person walk or run. And going back up to the top of that list, bobble head. So if you're an individual and you have this little itty bitty bobble head, just some awkward head movements, and you watch yourself walk or run, you're like, I don't know why that's there. Oftentimes you will find in a person's history that if you've had any kind of head trauma or whiplash injury, or any injury to the face, to the mouth, to the jaw, you could be a person that may present with a bobble head during gait. The other consideration is if you have any vision, so we're talking your visual system, your eyes, or vestibular deficits. So we're talking inner ear. So that's our onboard balance system, our vestibular system. those kinds of deficits will also play into a possible bobblehead. So when we see that, we want to be thinking of a couple of things right off the bat in terms of what you can do to start to correct it. Number one is vision exercises. So actually exercising your eyes, your eye muscles can be huge, because your eyes are reflexively connected to the musculature in your neck. So that can be really huge. And that's the same holds true with your inner ear, your vestibular system. So when I see that bobblehead, I'm already writing down in my notes. I'm like, maybe I've got to check out some vision and vestibular exercises for this person and make sure those systems are working well. And then in the podcast that we did before, we actually went over some possible vestibular exercises, and that's exactly what I'm talking about here.
The VORs, right?
Yeah, VOR. We're discussing like keeping your eyes on a target and moving your head, whether it's, side to side, up and down, or at angles, and really working on stabilizing your eyes on the target as your head and neck is in motion. Mm-hmm. That's one of our primary reflexes that's important for really any athletic movement. We have to be able to fixate our eyes on whatever it is that we're looking at while our head, neck, and body is in motion. So bobblehead, think visual exercises, vestibular exercises, and then also a big one is midline mobility and motor control exercises. So you want to be doing joint mobility drills with your neck, joint mobility drills with your jaw, joint mobility drills with your spine. Those are all really, really heavy hitters here.
And we touched on that in the podcast we did maybe over a year ago, but a lot of that, like the joint mobility that you talk about, is like kind of moving things side to side, like cars, and just kind of like rotating, not necessarily like static stretching or like banded extraction, like in your jaw, but just like moving it around kind of.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. You're learning how to control your end ranges of motion. You're learning how to move through full ranges of motion smoothly, right? And you're learning how to move your joints to enhance proprioception. And what you will often find with people is that when it comes to moving their neck and their jaw, they're pretty lousy at it. It's just an area that gets neglected. But once you start incorporating that into your regimen, you can get a lot of really high payoff results from that.
Yeah, like even when you try to do the side to side, it's like everyone's like,
see, historically, that's one of the hardest drills for people is the lateral glides.
I've been practicing.
Nice.
Been trying to do the circle deal. Yeah,
exactly.
But it is hard because it's like when we are so stuck and stiff, and that's a movement that we're not necessarily, if we're moving that way, we're probably turning our whole head or turning our whole shoulders. So like this motion doesn't necessarily get moved a lot. So that's interesting in terms of like the bobblehead, like practice.
Yeah. So bobblehead, vision, vestibular, and midline mobility. Those are huge heavy hitters there. And that's those, I see that a lot in runners. So it's something you want to consider for sure. So moving down the list, number 2 is loss of arm swing. And we're going to kind of graze over that one just because it's a deeper topic. I will tell you that if you're that person that has a loss of arm swing on one side, you want to be considering the what we would say is the contralateral frontal lobe. So if I have a loss of arm swing coming from my right side, my right shoulder, then I'm primarily focused on what my left brain is doing, and just really simply put, exercises for that particular area could be enough to help your left brain if that's the pattern you have, because voluntary movement from this right side is going to be initiated from my left frontal lobe. So again, the neurology goes deeper on that one. It's a little bit, it kind of is a little bit more complicated in terms of some of the pathways that we would discuss. But right now, let's just graze over that one and let's go down to the cerebellar pattern, because I feel like there could be some huge takeaway for folks on this one. So we have all seen people when they walk and run who present maybe what somebody would call being pigeon-toed, where your toes are pointed in, or maybe you have one toe pointed in. And what that can oftentimes give us give us clues into a person's cerebellar function. And remember, we said the cerebellum is a brain area that's responsible for our movement ABCs: accuracy, balance, coordination. And when you see an internally rotated lower body and upper body, so upper body coming from the shoulder. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with like some of those terms, internal, external, if you just draw a smiley face on your bicep and you point that smiley face inward at your midline or belly button, that is internal rotation of your shoulder, okay? On the lower body, we're talking about internal rotation coming primarily from the hip, which would then lead you to possibly that presentation of the pigeon toe individual. So when we see a inwardly rotated shoulder and hip, we start to think about the cerebellum on that side. So if my right shoulder is inwardly rotated and my right hip is inwardly rotated, I potentially need to do some exercise for my right cerebellum, because the cerebellum is going to be involved in the coordination of those parts of my body ipsilaterally. That's same side of the body. So right presentation of cerebellar function and right cerebellum is what I want to exercise. Now, we can see that on one side of the body, and we do. But we can also see that on both sides of the body. So both feet rotated in, both shoulders internally rotated. So the question then is, what do you do if you see that? Because that's a common one. So when it comes to the cerebellum, we have to first identify which side we need to possibly target. So if it's my right side, I need to do what we would refer to as complex nonlinear exercises on that side of my body. And when I say complex movements, what I mean is things that are more complicated than our traditional linear movements, say in a gym context. So a bicep curl, right, we're going to call linear.
Yep.
Right? But an elbow circle, right, is actually a circle moving through a more dynamic, more complicated range of motion. So complex nonlinear movements are very circular in fashion. They can even be figure eights. So the idea is complex movements upregulate cerebellar function. Because remember, the cerebellum is helping us with our ABCs: accuracy, balance, and coordination. Now, this is the interesting part. Linear movements don't upregulate it as much. Sometimes we even say linear movements put it to sleep a little bit because it's not novel enough or interesting enough to this part of our brain.
You don't have to think that hard. You can just do it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So the complex movements require a lot more concentration. They require more skill, and they actually are more activating for our brain because they can create more proprioception. Okay. So what we often see is that, in today's modern fitness world, people will pick up on what sometimes they'll have like a glute weakness, right? They'll have some extensor tone issues. And maybe that's the same person with the pigeon toe gait. And you hear people go, well, maybe it's because my glutes are weak and, my toes pointed in because I don't have enough extensor tone. And maybe I got to exercise my glutes or my hamstrings or whatever to fix that. And that could be true. However, what you see is people doing traditional stuff like banded monster walks or glute bridges.
Right.
Well, remember, that's linear motion. So you could actually be putting your cerebellum to sleep a little bit. It's going to be bored with that kind of exercise after you've become proficient with it. And instead, you have to figure out how to create more upregulation for that brain area through complex movement. So is that sinking in?
Yeah. So those exercises are boring from the start. So not necessarily even like adding complexity in terms of adding difficulty or load, but adding it in terms of like directional and more like coordination patterns.
Exactly. And actually, so it could be load, like but direction and speed and those kinds of things are often left out. Sometimes it's timing. right? I oftentimes will have people do more complex movements and they have to time it to a metronome.
Uh-huh.
And they have to use band resistance. So there's some more load. And maybe we're, doing it in different body positions to make it more challenging for a person's balance and coordination. And these are the types of qualities that upregulate that cerebellum, which can then have an influence on gait process and that presentation of both the internal and both the internal upper and lower body presentation that we discussed.
Is it specifically for internal, or if someone does have the external? Because I feel like that's something I see a little bit more often is people's feet pointed out.
Sure.
Is it
similar
or? Oh, it's the next one.
Yeah,
Great.
That's the next
Segue.
one. So perfect. So the next one is our Pmrf Gate. And so remember, we said Pmrf is going to be what we call the brainstem. And brainstem is a structure that's going to be largely involved in postural control during gait. It has a lot to do with our extensor muscles above T6 and our flexor muscles below T6. So if you think about that, that's walking and running. If we look at one side of the body and we look at, when the arm is swinging and the leg is swinging, we have flexors below T6 engaged at the same time as extensors above T6 engaged.
And just so like the thoracic spine space, like the thoracic is like in the middle.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're talking like upper mid back extensors, and then we're going lower to kind of think like oblique area down through the hip flexors. So we've got extensors, we've got flexors. And in the synergies going on between our extensors and flexors are what are a huge part of gait. And it's our brainstem that actually is a control center for these muscles. Okay. So when we look at and evaluate gait, I'm looking to see if a person may be expressing what we would call a Pmrf gait. And you just described it where the foot is actually outwardly rotated. So that's your duck foot walker. And that presentation can be seen on one side of the body, or that can be seen on both sides of the body. In the upper body, it's a little bit it's a little bit harder to differentiate between cerebellar pattern and Pmrf pattern, but the shoulder will also be presenting an internal rotation. Sometimes it will actually be lower than the other one, because remember, extensors above T6, now I'm starting to maybe lose muscle tone in the upper and mid trap region. And that can sometimes give us those postural deficits that we often see on one side of the body, where the shoulder is slightly internally rotated, but also kind of drooping down. And then on that same side of the body, you would see potentially an outwardly rotated foot. Okay.
I see.
There's a little bit more going into, like, you can even see some of that presentation in the hand, where if I'm watching somebody walk away from me, so I'm looking at their backside, you'll often see that they have some flexion in the hand and fingers. And because they're so internally rotated, you'll see their whole palm as they walk away from you. And what's happening is they have excessive muscle tone in the flexor region, hands, wrist, forearm. Also some rotation, some pronation of the forearm is a common subtlety there. And that's because those flexor muscles are just kind of having a difficult time relaxing, right? So the flexor extensor synergies are not as balanced as they should be. So when you see this presentation, we want to be thinking about posture and muscle tone, and also stability, right? Because the brainstem is largely involved in our reflexive stabilization. It's a big one because it has so much to do with that postural tone. So a possible solution, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So we talked about complex nonlinear movements for addressing cerebellar issues in gait, and we talked about using those complex nonlinear movements on the same side as the problem. But when it comes to the Pmrf presentation, the duck-footed person, we would actually use those complex nonlinear movements on the opposite side of the body. And the reason being, so let's walk through, like, let's say I'm the right Pmrf person. I'm the person you see running down the street, and my right leg is swinging all over the place and my foot is turned out, right? I need to be doing my complex nonlinear movements on the left side of my body.
Okay.
And the reason that is the case is how our voluntary movement pathways work. So when I exercise the left side of my body with complex nonlinear movement, so let's say I'm doing something complex with my wrist, like a circle. Okay, that movement is going to be initiated by my opposite brain. So left complex movement initiated by my right frontal lobe. And my right frontal lobe is going to fire down into my right brainstem, and it's going to help with reflexive stabilization. So you can imagine if I'm going to pick up a weight with my left hand, I'm only going to be able to pick up that weight if the opposite side of my body is reflexively stabilizing to allow my limb to move. Mm-hmm. Right. So when it comes to voluntary movement, one of the pathways that we're interested in is that one. So it turns out that when I do complex nonlinear movements with the left side of my body, it activates my right brain. My right brain talks to my right brainstem, and my right brainstem basically speaks to all of the stabilization muscles that I need on my right side. So I can affect muscle tone, right? And those imbalances in flexor extensor tone, I can affect that by exercising the opposite side of my body, which is counterintuitive, but that's how the pathway works. So these are the folks that when they have Pmrf issues, these are the folks that are not getting results from exercising where they see the problem. Right. So your foot's externally rotated and you're doing all sorts of, exercises on that right side of the dysfunction, and you're not getting the result that you're looking for because you're actually activating the opposite side of your brain and working on the wrong Pmrf. And this is why so many people go to more of a traditional rehab setting, and they start exercising the body part where they have the problem, but they're not getting the full result that they want because perhaps their Pmrf is mediating their pain or mediating their movement problem.
So with this, like you'd mentioned, working the opposite side, and you use the wrist circles as an example, is it crucial to have it be just on the opposite side? If you do both at the same time, will that dull the response that you're going to get, or does it need to be?
So I would gravitate more towards a unilateral approach for this particular presentation, which means that you could also do unilateral strength training on the opposite side of the body. And if you concentrated on some level of unilateral work for, say, 4 weeks or 6 weeks, you may have a really big influence on that problem, which is living on the other side of your body. So it doesn't have to be the wrist circle that I showed. It doesn't have to be necessarily complex nonlinear movement. You can actually have some really good results through more traditional strength training practices, but just done in a unilateral fashion.
Interesting. So yes. And I mean, a lot of the videos you're sharing on Instagram and those type of exercises that you're doing, some of the things you had me do where it's like that pendulum type of motion, or things kind of move in and out. I can see now why that would be really.
Yeah, you're making that connection exactly, because a lot of that contralateral movement that I like to program for people is focusing on extensors above T6, flexors below.
Yes.
And everything is reciprocated, just like walking and running, right? Just like throwing, right? Mm-hmm. Those are very human movements. And if you think about it, when you go into a traditional gym setting, a lot of what we're doing is bilateral. A barbell squat, both sides of your body are in the same position the whole time. So we are not necessarily exercising the muscles in the way that they work together for in more relation to walking and running in the gait process, right? So, so yes, those contralateral styles of movement are really awesome for addressing these PMRF issues, and that some other things that we've used in the past is like crawling, right? Different crawling exercises, also really good for that. And of course, the stuff you experienced with me, the contralateral work, where we're doing a lot of swinging of light dumbbells and sort of mimicking walking, running, throwing. If people are familiar with steel clubs, I'm a big advocate of steel clubs, and a lot of the movements we do with steel clubs are also mimicking those types of movement patterns.
That makes sense, like the mace and the club work and things like that.
Absolutely, especially if you're doing it on one side of the body. It's very everything sort of is very reciprocated and opposite hand, opposite leg type of movement.
It's so interesting because it's like when those type of like the clubs, for example, they come in a bunch of various weights, but it doesn't need to be that heavy, right?
No.
It could just be like the light one and just doing the swings around your head or whatever, bringing it back around.
Right. So what I found over the years is that when it comes to training in a way that is utilizing more of our reflexive responses, we want to go lighter. Right, we want to go lighter, and that's why light bands are really good. Light dumbbells, light kettlebells, light steel clubs go a long way for getting our body to really respond to things reflexively. Doesn't mean that heavy lifting's bad. I'm saying this is an addition to some of the heavier loaded stuff that a person might do.
It could be part of it. It could be like what you do before your heavy lift or after your heavy lift. Like it could be part of the same program. So I do want to wrap this up before we get into 90 minutes because I'm sure we could go there. But I wanted to address Amber's question here. She said she feels like sometimes with the Bobble Head that she has the opposite response where she gets her a lot of tension through her neck and her chin kind of starts to point up. And then she has to remind herself to kind of bring it back down. Sure. Does that kind of fall into any one of these categories here where
Absolutely.
It's something?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did not mention this. So when I'm evaluating for Bobble Head, sometimes what will happen is if a person is struggling with a Bobble Head, their body will compensate in exactly the opposite way. So then they become more, their muscles increase their tone. They become more stiff in the neck. So sometimes we see a presentation where a person looks very rigid, and it's basically it's a protective output because their head is unstable. Their body's working really, really hard to increase muscle tone to help stabilize. So that is, I actually put the excessive tone person, the stiff neck, I put it in the same category. And the solution is the same.
So the vision exercises.
The vision exercises, the vestibular exercises, because remember, those reflexes speak to our neck musculature. You can have muscles that are expressing too high of tone or too low of tone. And by exercising your eyes and your inner ear, that tone begins to recalibrate and balance out better. I would also say hit your jaw mobilizations and your neck mobilizations for sure.
And these you can all get a lot of the jaw and all the joint mobilizations you can get in your basic bundle, right?
Yeah.
Which is it's the most fair price I've seen out there. So absolutely worth getting into. Make sure to link in the comments below.
Awesome. Yeah, exactly.
What else you got going? Where else can people find you?
You can find us on Instagram at Kruse Elite and our website, KruseElite.com.
Cool, Taylor. Well, again, I appreciate your time. This was awesome information.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome.